Okay. Try not to smash it as I did yesterday. All right. Thanks a lot. So very happy to present a piece of this experience as well. So just to start, this work hasn't been submitted yet. So you will see much more relaxed than yesterday. Anyway, so I'm going to be short on the introduction, and as has been shown before, we don't know much about the adaptation of wellness, fatigue, physical performance when teams fly or arrive at an altitude. So you know a little bit about the context as well. So we have this team, Australian team coming from Canberra. They flew in first into Santa Cruz, and in Santa Cruz they met the team from Bolivia, where they played and trained almost every day for about six days. So as you've seen with all the other measures, this period of 6 days was for us to establish baseline measure for different parameters. There were daily measures like body mass, simple data like that. Also resting heart rate and resting heart rate variability, since as we cannot get any measure of sympathetic activity with heart rate variability, we can get at least a measure of vagal parasympathetic modulation, which can be used as a converse. So when sympathetic activity increases, parasympathetic activity decreases. So at least we have a marker of autonomic function that can be measured every day to track the changes. Also, basic perceived measures like wellness, well-being. So this is, for example, one of the easiest way to get a simple and very quick idea of the kind of perceived wellness of the players. So like a 0 to 5 Likert scale on how fatigued do you feel, what about your sleep, your mood, and so on. So you have these 5 items rated from 0 to 5. You add them, and you have a score about 25. The higher the score, the better the wellness. And as well, Lake Louise score that has been introduced earlier this morning. That was upon awakening in the morning. During each training session, or more precisely at the start of each training session, we have the player just running a submax run, very easy, very submax, so 9K per hour. And we just collected the heart rate responses to this submax run, and also simply the RPE responses on a 0 to 10 scales. Of course, during all the games, we had also an estimate of training load with the method of RPE multiplied by the duration. On the side of these daily measures, there were also some performance tests. And as you can see, the stadium was quite packed because they knew that something big was ready to happen. Actually, they were here for a school competition. So the data I'm presenting today is about the yo-yo intermittent recovery test level 1, which we use as an index of high-intensity running performance, and also 20-meter sprint, maximal sprint. So these tests were done just once, 5 days before they traveled to La Paz. So with this data, we have wellness, heart rate, and performance baseline. And it was important to have kind of a standardized baseline to make sure that we can assess in an accurate way the changes when they flew into La Paz. So they were in La Paz. You've seen a few pictures already. From there, again, both teams trained and played almost every day. Or they trained almost every day. They played upon arrival, 5 days and 7 days after. The first important thing or important results about that is when you look at the training load, is more a perceived training load from both teams. You see in black players born at sea level. So in Laura's slide, that was the Australian. That's player born at altitude. So that's the Bolivians. You see that when they were training at Santa Cruz, so close to sea level, the Australian already had a tendency to show a greater training load. Can be related to some kind of training contents, can be just different sensibility. And this difference was, you're gonna see again my effect size, Cohen's effect size. So so they had a moderately greater training load. What is interesting is that when both teams moved to La Paz, the Bolivian, the sea level, the player born at sea level, still tended to show greater training load, but with a factor by 2. So, which in the end makes sense. That shows that the fact that they were not acclimatized for almost the same training volume, they just perceived the training load as twice harder as it was from before. So now, what about the adaptation of daily measures? So let's start with something quite simple. You see here the heart rate responses, so daily heart rate measures, so 1 point, 1 day. In black, you have the Bolivians born at sea level. In white, you have the Bolivians. So as you can see at the start, at the non-altitude, the Bolivians tended to have a lower heart rate, okay? And then here, what happens when they moved to La Paz? So as we can expect, heart rate is increasing quite substantially in both teams, and then tends to stay above the baseline levels for both teams. And you can see that at least for the sea level athletes or players, this value came within normal range for about 10 days. So at least on at the level of the just resting heart rate, we can say that they needed about 10 days to go back to their resting values. We don't have more data for the Bolivians because they were not followed up for the second week, which is a pity, but there was a logistic constraint. Another important part is also what about this increase? So like the acute effect of the ascent. This is actually a little bit surprising because if you look at the differences in the changes, you see that in the end, the sea level players displayed a lower increase in heart rate. And I guess that you would all expect the converse. They are not acclimatized, so you expect they're going to show a greater increase in heart rate. As you see, we can observe almost the same trend for the resting heart rate variability index. So again, an index of vagal activity. Vagal activity is decreasing substantially in both teams when they arrive to altitude, so showing indirectly that they have an increase in sympathetic activity. But again, the decrease in heart rate variability is lower for the sea level athletes. So that just goes against what we all expected. And the only explanation I have at this stage is that, as you've seen with Laura's data, there was a huge and a substantial increase in plasma volume for the Bolivian player when they went down. And this increase in plasma volume will affect directly resting baseline heart rate and also resting vagal activity. So it means that as we try to track the acute effect of the ascent, it's just compromised by the acute effects or the acute changes in fluids that occurs for the Bolivians. So what we see makes sense for the Australians, but what we see for the Bolivians is kind of confounded by the other changes in blood volume actually. Let's see now about the heart rate responses to the 5 minutes submaximal test. So again, we have differences that expressed as a percentage of heart rate max. So kind of stable measure at sea level. The Bolivians are lower. And then we have an increase when they reach altitude. And again, exactly as the baseline, the resting measure, we have the same thing. Both teams are increasing, but because of these likely differences in blood volume, in the end, which is not really expected, we have a lower increase in heart rate during exercise that displayed the Australians. What is interesting is that compare with heart rate variability or heart rate, exercise heart rate doesn't come back to baseline measure. So we have kind of a different information. If you look at heart rate only in the morning, you will say, okay, after 10 days, they are acclimatized because they went back to normal. When you look at exercise heart rates, they're not coming back. And that will have greater link with performance, as you will see just after. What is interesting also is just to look at the simple RPE measures after this 5-minute run. So just at the end of this 5 minutes, rating how hard was the exercise, 0.5, from 0 to 10, sorry. And you see that, interestingly, for the Bolivians, these values remain almost stable wherever the test is performed, either at sea level or altitude, it remains stable. For the Australian, as soon as they arrive, so the first 2 or 3 tests done in altitude, they show clearly strong, greater RPE responses, which lends me to say that this is probably one of the easiest measures to get, but you get something very, very clear about how hard they perceive the exercise. Lake Louise score, so which is kind of a global index of how well they cope with the hypoxic environment. Quite stable, which is quite expected for the Bolivians. A strong tendency for a decreased well-being just immediately after ascent, but only one night, and then it stabilizes. So again, we have a kind of a dissociation. You see that all the measures are not linked. Heart rate is going down, heart rate exercise is staying up, perceived Lake Louise is just affected for one day. And finally, if you just look at the overall wellness, kind of again, just change once upon arrival and then tend to stabilize. So the first thing is that all the data, all the measures I show you are very basic, easy to measure in an applied field settings, but they all tend to show something else, which for me shows the interest of having all of them, and then to try to understand why one is moving and another one is not moving. And of course, there is a lot of differences, different responses at the individual levels, but within this time I cannot go through that. But again, if you look at individual changes, it's quite interesting as well. So let's move now to the last part of the results about the performance, which is maybe what is of greater interest for us. So if you think first about the yo-yo data. So let's focus first on just this part, which is the camp. So still in black, Australians, Bolivians, born at sea level, born in altitude. So as you can see, there is a decrease in both teams, but at least in this case, the changes in performance is what we expected. So if you look at, there is the effect size is 2, so it's a huge effect. So is that a much more greater decrease in performance for the Australian than for the Bolivians. What is interesting as well is that the recovery of performance, when you look over a week spent at altitude, the recovery is greater by 85% of chance of a greater increase for the Australian. So they show a greater decrease, but they also recover more, just maybe by the fact that they reach lower levels. But what is important is that even after 11, 12 days, they haven't, at least the Australian, they haven't matched the pre-altitude levels. So just talking on a purely acclimation base, or just thinking about how long would you need to be able to match up your baseline levels, in this case, almost 2 weeks won't be enough. If you look at the heart rate in the morning, you would say, yes, maybe that's enough. So again, in this case, performance is much more better matched with what we've seen with exercise heart rate, which stayed impaired even in the end of the camp. Okay. A little bit on the side of this study, I managed to get some data from some of the Australian before this camp, and also some data after, and that started to be interesting as well. As you can see, if you just compare the changes between start of the camp and 10 days after the camp, when they went back to Canberra, we have a very large increase, so an effect size of 3. That will be 15 times the smallest OSI change, so a huge effect, like the post-camp. So that fits perfectly with what Professor Chapman presented about this kind of window. When is it the best to perform? At least within this context, we had a huge improvement in high-intensity running performance 10 days after the end of the camp. What is interesting as well is that this amazing increase was achieved within about 4 to 5 weeks. And again, if we compare what happened during another training period earlier in the year, where the coach put a little bit of emphasis on conditioning. Within the same period, almost 4 to 5 weeks, they didn't have the same magnitude of changes. So just isolating and comparing these changes and this one, you would be happy to say, well, the effect of the camp was amazing, because we managed to have an increase in performance that was 2/3, that was 3 times greater than what they had in during normal training. But I don't have enough data on the exact content of what has been done here and here to adjust for the training load. But looking at that looks interesting. Now, interesting data about speed, the 20-meter times. So again, just looking at what happened during the camp first, you see a kind of a tendency, which is not significant, but definitely substantial, about a slowing of the players. So the more they stayed at the altitude, the slower the players, which is, we start to be problematic, especially for team sports. So, and as you see, the Bolivians are going slower and slower, while, sorry, the Australians are going slower and slower, while the Bolivians don't show much differences. So they cope better with the travel, and also they are less affected by the changes in altitude. Which is interesting as well is that, remember the large increase in yo-yo 10 days after the camp. This goes again in the same direction. So this player kept on being even slower 10 days after. So they might have become much more fitter, definitely after the camp, but they became slower. So I'm going to try just to summarize. So what you've seen, and that was quite expected, that all the physiological, physical, and also perceived wellness measure were much more slower. So the Australians were slower to adapt when they travel to La Paz. Based on the monitoring data from the morning, I would say, and that's based also on more analysis that I didn't present about correlation, regression, all this kind of stuff, that's showing that the only variables that are a little bit linked with changes in performance are heart rate during exercise and SD1, so the vagal activity, heart rate variability. These are the only 2 measures that can eventually explain a little bit, but the share variance is not greater than 50%, so it's still not that great to trying to predict any changes. And also it can work well to track player adaptation, but especially in the non-acclimatized player. So that worked well for the Bolivian, for the Australian, sorry. But as you've seen, for the Bolivian, because of these changes in blood volume, that messed up a little bit the analysis we can do. In any case, of course, collecting this data about the perceptual measure, wellness, Lake Louise, makes sense on the health perspective to see if the players are coping well with the camp. That's clear. But they show very little, very limited usefulness to predict change in performance, because as you've seen, Lake Louise score, wellness score, recovered within 1 or 2 days, while performance was still affected over 2 weeks. So just to conclude, so about using altitude camp more as a fitness, as a tool to improve fitness. Of course, in one way you can be very happy with the large improvement in high intensity running performance, but that clearly has to be balanced with the moderate decrease in sprinting capacity. So I will leave that to the choice of the coaches. Is it worth improving fitness, impairing sprinting speed? Will depend on your activity in the end. Of note as well, trying to balance a little bit the effect of the camp, all players and almost all the staff, we all got really sick. On the top of that, some of us even have been badly injured. So as you know, high altitude is a hostile environment. So again, thinking about planning a camp, I always think twice. I think some of us won't even want to come back. Some of us wanted to leave even during the camp. So, and also of importance as well, winning is not about running. So it's not because of our guys are fitter that we're going to win. And also, even going a bit further, there are more consideration at the individual level that has to be taken about position, that some players or roles in the team, some player would definitely benefit if they were fitter, but others, that won't change much their efficiency on the field. So again, shall we really bring the whole team in altitude? Shall we all implement all that for everyone? That can be questioned as well. And as well, for that, I'm happy with what I heard from Carlston yesterday morning, is that most of the time, and especially in team sport, if we train well first, we might be able to get the same benefits but with much less hassle and less cost, of course. Yes, logistics. So again, putting everything into a cost benefits, I'm still not questioning, but having some limitation of implementing this kind of big camp for team sports in these settings. Thank you very much. Thank you.